All right, so here we are. Welcome back. And today we're going to continue our discussion, but focused on the actual methods used in sociology for data collection. So today we're going to be talking about experiments, because that's kind of like the classic model of data collection in all the sciences. And then we'll talk about other things we do, because you can't do everything in an experiment. So let's review the scientific method really quickly. First, you select a research problem. You can basically pick any topic under the sun as long as you can test it using empirical data. Generally, the research problem is going to be related to one or another sociological perspective or theory. Second, you review the literature. Now, what does this mean? This means reading as much as you can about previous research done on the same topic. Now, this can be really useful because, first of all, you get different points of view and you understand better what the core debates are or issues are or the questions are. So rather than simply writing something which is very obvious or simply blindly repeats what somebody else has already done, you can do something a little different or do a careful replication of stuff that's been done before. It also gives you good ideas about different methods to use, different techniques to use. Third, formulate a hypothesis. So based on your reading, based on what you know, you develop a predictive statement about two variables, two or more, obviously, variables which you're going to test in your research. You want to look into control variables, other variables you want to measure just in case. And here you want to think about operational definitions. That is, taking the abstract variables and putting them into a measurable form. 4, choosing a research design. This means deciding how to go about collecting your data in order to test your hypothesis. Then you go out and you actually collect the data. So whether you do a research, you do a survey, you do something else, you're going to implement your research design. And of course, this is usually what takes a lot of time. Number 6, analyze the data. So once you've collected the data, depending on the type of data, maybe you put it into a computer program and test for correlations. Maybe you analyze it ethnographically and you look for interesting issues or comments. And finally, state your conclusion. So just because you were wrong doesn't mean you wasted your time, because science is all about testing and questioning. So if it turns out you were wrong, you can publish those results. You can say, I tried to replicate the results of so-and-so's research, and it didn't work. Now, it's a little unfortunate that science, publishers tend to prefer experiments that went right. But technically speaking, you can publish just as much things about research that went wrong or where you reject your hypothesis, because, again, science is about questioning, not just about proving. And also you want to make sure you state how your work, what you've done, applies to the broader theories that you've been discussing or applies to social questions. So that would be in your final conclusion. How does this research apply to the broader world? So let's talk about the experiment, which is, as I said, the classic form of research method. In an experiment, we take two groups and we test the effect of an independent variable on those two groups. And the way we do it is we have an experimental group where we'll apply the variable. So that group, we're going to do something to change the group. And there'll be a control group that, at least in the key condition, will not change, or will have a different kind of change, so that we can compare what happened to the groups after the change. So in ideal circumstances, the group should be fairly similar. You don't need a random sample in an experiment, because the main difference you're looking at is what happened before the change and what is there after the change. So, for example, if I had an experiment about video games, the question might be, do violent video games make kids or children more violent? So I would have two groups of children, let's say 50 in each group. One group would play violent video games for maybe 4 hours. The other group would watch nice movies for 4 hours. So then I'll measure the difference in the level of violence in their behavior. So before, I would observe them for a while, see if they have any violent behavior, and then afterwards I would observe them for a while, see if they had any violent behavior. So in theory, or according to the hypothesis, the children who played violent video games should exhibit more violent behavior afterwards, right? Here's an example of an experiment. It didn't necessarily follow that classic example. This is an experiment done by a man named Stanley Milgram. And the experiment is called Obedience to Authority. He wrote a book of that name, which is definitely one of the recommended books on our list. So the experiment itself was based on the experience of World War II, where 6 million or 11 million people were killed in cold blood, basically, in concentration camps, along with all kinds of horrible torture and treatment. And not only were tens of thousands of people directly involved in this behavior, but hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of other Germans knew or should have known it was going on and did nothing about it. So Milgram wondered why this is true. The Germans said, well, they told us we had to, we were afraid. Okay, is that true? Or were the Germans simply more obedient than other people? Were they sadistic? So the question he had, could the same thing happen here or in another country, like America? So he set up an experiment to find out if regular Americans could be made to obey an immoral command. He put an ad in a paper to get participants, and he told them that they were doing an experiment in negative reinforcement, learning, basically. So he would have people come in, and he would tell them, we're doing an experiment in learning theory of negative reinforcement, which means we're going to expect you to memorize a number of word pairs, and then if you repeat them correctly, you'll be fine. If you repeat them wrong, we're going to give you a zap, right? So every time you make a mistake, you can get a zap. And not only do you get a zap, but the next time you'll get a bigger zap. So this is how they set up the experiment. The experimenter would be in the lab with a white coat, lab coat, and he represented the authority. You had the learner. The learner was chained or was connected to this machine that would give him electrical shocks. In addition, he had little buttons in front of him to mark the correct answer when he was asked a question about a word pair. Now, when he went in there, originally the learner says, oh, I have a heart condition. Is this going to be bad? The experimenter said, no, it'll be no problem. And the learner kind of reluctantly sits down and agrees to be strapped in. But during the experiment, he stops. He refuses to participate. He complains about his heart. And then finally just stops altogether. He could be dead. Now, as you could probably guess, the learner was not really a subject. He was not really a participant in the experiment. He was part of the experiment. So he was an actor. And the real question was the teacher. The teacher was what we call the subject, the person we were trying to find out how they would behave. And the teacher is put in front of this machine, which had voltage levels from 15 up to 450, and it said mild shock at the beginning until you go all the way to the top. It's an extreme shock, deadly shock. And the question was, the teacher, knowing that the learner has a heart condition, knowing that, or hearing him complain and say he wants to go, and fearing that he may be dead, does the teacher continue with the experiment? Does he continue to apply punishment to the learner even when it seems that everything has become ridiculous? And the experimenter there, in the white lab coat, his job is to prod the teacher and to keep him going. But he doesn't force him. He only says things like, the experiment requires that you continue. And the question is, will the teacher continue or not? Now, you might ask yourself, would you continue? If you hear this guy in the other room screaming and yelling and complaining and then apparently collapsing or no longer participating, would you continue to give him electrical shocks? Now, when Milgram asked people, of course, they all said, no, we would never do that. No, Americans won't. Only the most sadistic people would go ahead and do that. So this is what the experiment looked like, the box, as it were. As we can see here, you would have signs flowing from low shock all the way up here to extreme shock, and then over here you just had X, X, X. It didn't even say anything. It had lots of switches. It looked very impressive. The lights would come on. A little thing up there would move to indicate that you had given a guy a shock. Right? But of course, this was all fake. Right? So the real question is, the teacher, the person placed in the position of teacher, really going to go ahead and apply these shocks to the learner? There were a couple other things they did. They made it seem like the teacher and the learner picked their roles out of a hat. So the teacher should have known or knew he could have been the learner. And again, you would assume that most people would not continue to these levels, right? How far would you go? Well, thank you, Sherry, for your opinion. This is, by the way, is the learner. What do you look like? Very nondescript, kind of non-threatening person. They deliberately picked somebody they thought most people would feel some sympathy for. They did different variations, by the way. Sometimes you had women as the learner and women as the teacher. This is them strapping him in. The experimenter is in the white lab coat. This is the learner, of course. And then they would have the teacher assist, so that he would really feel the reality. This is real. This is actually happening. And this is during the experiment, at least during one version of the experiment, where they had the teacher actually hold the learner's hand down so that he could get shocked. So this simulated extremely close conditions between the teacher and the learner. So what actually happens? Now, they had different variations. In most of the variations, the authority represented by the teacher was in the same room, and the learner was in another room. That was the initial condition. And they found that in this condition, 65% of the teachers went all the way to the end of the board. Not only did they go to the end of the board, but they were told to repeat the last voltage, which was 450 volts, 3 times. They were told to keep going even though they'd reached the end of the board, and the guy in there was unconscious or seemed to be unconscious, maybe dead of a heart attack, and 65% of the teachers continued all the way. When the learner was in the same room as the teacher, then there was a drop. So when people could see the effect on the learner, or maybe just the proximity of the learner, maybe they felt more pressure from the learner, perhaps. When the teacher had to touch the learner, like in the previous picture, only 30% went all the way to the end. But again, imagine 30%. Are these 30% sadists? They went all the way to the end, holding the guy's hand down on a metal pad so he could be shocked at 450 volts, even though he was apparently dead. And they continued. Now the real drop starts to come when the experimenter left the room. When the authority figure left the room, then participation, or full participation, dropped to only 22%. So that's from 65 to 22%. And then when they had just a regular guy in charge, so the experimenter would leave and he'd say, you there, you take charge. And apparently some guy who was obviously also part of the experiment would take over. Then again, it dropped to 20%. He was not accepted as an authority figure. And in another condition in which they had 3 people together doing the shocks, if the other 2 people rebelled, then the third person, the subject, almost always rebelled. Only 10% went all the way to the end, which is still kind of amazing when you think about it. So what we find is 2 things. The closer the authority, the greater the obedience. This was, of course, Milgram's main question or hypothesis. He believed that an authority figure had to be close to the teacher. In this case, the teacher, the person doing the punishment. On the other hand, the closer the victim, the lower the obedience. So there was a negative correlation. The closer the victim was to the punisher, the lower the obedience. So again, it's a lot easier to punish somebody who's maybe in another room or far away and you can't see the consequences of your behavior. They also found, of course, that peer pressure was extremely strong. By the way, when they did the experiment with women, there was no substantial difference between the behavior of women and the behavior of men. But what they found that was kind of surprising from a psychological point of view is that people who went all the way were not happy. They were under extreme stress. Some of them laughed uncontrollably. Many of them were sweating profusely. And they constantly asked, do I have to go on? Do I have to go on? And the teacher would say, you have to go on. And they would go on, but not happily. They were under stress. Very few people went all the way through without signs of extreme stress. But afterwards, these people tended to blame the victim or the authority. They would say, well, this guy kept telling me to go on. I wanted to stop, but he told me to go on. Literally the words made by one of the subjects. Or other people said, well, I tried to help the victim, but he kept making so many mistakes. I tried to help him. I tried to emphasize the right answer, and he kept making mistakes. So what could I do? So what's interesting is this fits in with a lot of the logic when people are forced into a position of power over others, or particularly not power, but in this case, that they're punishing other people. They have a tendency to blame those other people. And this has a lot of ramifications, if you think about it, in terms of race relations, gender relations, or other types of unequal circumstances. Now, experiments as a whole, and Stanley Milgram's experiment also was criticized. A lot of people said, look, this environment is artificial. How does this tell us about what might be happening in a concentration camp when there are many more variables involved, where the people selected to be guards have have been, are selected because they're racist, because they're sadists. It's not really the same situation. It's also very expensive. It's expensive to run an experiment of this sort. In Milgram's case, to have an experiment with one subject might have taken an hour or an hour and a half, even 2 hours from beginning to end. So that means you've got the experimenter, the learner, other people standing around. You have to pay them for 2 hours for every subject. So it's expensive. As a result, very often people in experiments, they will try to limit the number of subjects. In Milgram's case, he had 40 subjects in each group or each condition, and then he had a total of about 12 or 13 different groups that he ran the experiment with. And the tendency then is to control other variables by making your group homogeneous, all the same. So one of the biggest critiques of experiments in social psychology is that they use all white men. And why do they do that? What about women? The assumption is everybody else is going to behave the same as white men, or can you necessarily infer from the behavior of white men how black men or black women would behave? So that's, again, a negative on the methodological side. And finally, there's obviously a lot of ethical concerns. Whenever you put somebody in an artificial situation, you're changing their life. And imagine these people being put under so much stress and later coming out thinking, I could have killed that guy. They thought they were killing the guy. Now, Milgram did have debriefing. In other words, after each experiment with the subject, they would sit the subject down, they would talk about how they feel, they felt that was part of the data, and then they would kind of break the ice by saying, by the way, this wasn't a real experiment, the learner was not being shocked. The learner would come back in, and the subject would feel better. They weren't really killing anybody in the other room. But still, you have to think, they went through an experience feeling that they had killed somebody else, and that they were capable of killing somebody else. So that's a lot to do to people. That's kind of a mind bender. Right? So there's a lot of ethical concerns. Is this kind of experiment ethical? And this is what I mean by when you do experiments in the social sciences, you have to think a lot about how your experiment will influence or impact the people you're researching. And when you're doing any kind of experiment, nowadays there are ethical requirements you have to go through, and particularly important if you're doing experiments with any protected groups like children or people with mental disabilities. These people there are much higher levels of ethical concerns for these people. Field experiments. Now, a field experiment is when you can't do an experiment, so you take something happening already in the real world and you look at the differences that happen. So, for example, this will allow you to see whether or not your variable has an impact. So, for example, let's say your school is going through a major change. They're having a new degree or new requirements for a degree. You might do a field experiment and study the differences before and after. So that would give you one dimension of an experiment. Or you could compare with another university that is not going through the same changes and say, well, which university has improved the most, perhaps. But usually those types of experiments are very difficult because you've only got one or two cases. You don't have a lot of cases you can go through. Another thing is using real-life conditions and then conducting an experiment that simply relies on people's reactions. So you might have seen this on YouTube or other video sources, where people will kind of stage a scene to see how people react. Right? So maybe a guy in a restaurant is super racist. How will people react to it? So it's a staged scene. So this also could be considered a field experiment because you're not controlling all of the variables. You're only controlling a few, and then you're seeing how it will affect those people. So the loss of control means you lose a lot of the validity of the experiment. But still, because it's real, because it's a real life situation, at least for the people in the experiment, it may have additional validity. So here's an example. One example has been done several times. You send applications for a job, and you see who gets a response. So some applications you send in with a white applicant, and some applications send in with a black applicant. And the only difference is maybe that you change the name and you have a different picture on the application form. And the application forms themselves will be almost identical in terms of level, experience, and things like that. The question is, who will get more response? Who will get more interviews? And unfortunately, they find that white applicants tend to get far more responses to these types of applications. Another one, for example, you could stage on the street, will male or female beggars be given more money? So you'll have a male beggar go out for a while, then a female beggar go out, and then compare how much money they collect. Again, that's another fairly simple experiment. Of course, you don't control the conditions. How many people are going by? It's difficult to control all of the conditions involved when you're doing a field experiment. So thank you very much for participating in this lecture, and come back for the next lecture on other types of research methods.